right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for braving the snowy roads to get out and join us for today's art break. I appreciate it. So today's talk is presented in conjunction with the exhibition Designed, Printed, and Fired, featuring the innovative work of artist Tak-Yam Lee, who brings together the technology of 3D printing with traditional ceramic making. Tak-Yam was actually scheduled to give a talk here last week, and we had to cancel because of the weather. But luckily for us, he has agreed to come back. So he will be here on February 12th to give this lecture, and there'll be a live demonstration of the 3D printing process. And if you get here early at 5:30, there are also going to be some family-friendly activities connected to his exhibition. So we hope you'll join us for that wonderful evening of celebrating Tak-Yam and his work. And that lecture does start at 6 p.m. and is free. If you would like to support this and other free educational programming offered at the KIA, donations can be made at the front desk and online when you pre-register. I am now very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Ryan Lewis, who is an associate professor of graphic design at Western Michigan University. There, he teaches courses in typography, bookmaking, letterpress, and advanced problem solving. Professor Lewis's research interests include stop motion animation, type design, and animated typography. His video work has been exhibited and screened in the US and abroad. Professor Lewis earned an MFA from Ohio University and a BFA from Utah State University. We're excited to have him here today speaking about the art of typography. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ryan Lewis.
Thanks. It's good to be here with you today. And yeah, thanks for coming out on yet another cold and snowy day. The roads still aren't great out there. So yeah, I'm Ryan. I've been at Western Michigan University for about 12 and a half years now, and I'm really enjoying it there. Let's go right into it. So first of all, what is typography? I would consider it giving visual form to written communications. So designing the various visual attributes of a message so that it will reach its intended audience. This is a really well-known piece by Paula Scher, a pentagram designer who has designed several posters and campaigns for the Public Theater in New York City. And you can see the typography really playing a major role in this piece here. So I thought it would be interesting to start out with a few of the theories different designers approach typography with. This first one is Adrian Frutiger, and he is a Swiss type designer who has designed many typefaces you may have seen probably. But his thought is, if you remember the shape of your spoon at lunch, it has to be the wrong shape. The spoon and the letter are tools, one to take food from the bowl, the other to take information off the page. When it is a good design, the reader has to feel comfortable because the letter is both banal and beautiful. So he's kind of expressing that idea that if a design is really well done, you don't even notice it. It's just becomes part of the woodwork, part of the scenery, and you're really experiencing the food or you're experiencing the information and not really thinking about the design of the typography or the design of the spoon. Here's one of the kind of classic expressions of what typography is in the modernist way of thinking about it. So this is Beatrice Ward, a writer and type scholar. So she wrote this essay called The Crystal Goblet, which is kind of one of the seminal design texts from that time period about how typography works. So this is one of her metaphors for typography. But a good speaking voice is one which is inaudible as a voice. I need not warn you that if you begin listening to the inflections and speaking rhythms of a voice from a platform, you are falling asleep. So if you're paying too much attention to the idiosyncrasies of the voice of the speaker, which hopefully you're not doing to me right now, it means you're not paying attention to the message. And so the message is kind of getting superseded. And then here's a more recent type designer. This is Tobias Frere Jones. And he's kind of referring to Beatrice Ward's way of thinking about typography. He says, the sort of classical modernist line on how aware a reader should be of a typeface is that they shouldn't be aware of it at all. It should just be this crystal goblet there to just hold and display and organize the information. But I don't think it's really quite as simple as that. The reader will certainly be affected by it the same way that an actor that's miscast in a role will affect someone's experience of a movie or a play. They'll still follow the plot, but be less convinced or affected. I think typography is similar to that, where a designer choosing typefaces is essentially a casting director. And one last example here. This is David Carson, known for his postmodern designs in the 1990s primarily. Don't confuse legibility with communication. Just because something is legible doesn't mean it communicates, and more importantly, doesn't mean it communicates the right thing. So I thought it would be interesting also to show a few visual examples. So the first of these examples is from Frutiger, the very first quote. So you can see his type design for the type family of Univers on the left there, and then on the right you can see one of David Carson's covers for Ray Gun magazine from the 90s. And so you can kind of see their philosophies informing the way these pieces were designed. So take a look at these words. You may already be making some assumptions about them based on the typeface or the form of the words. So does the form carry meaning in and of itself? I believe it does. You're probably assuming maybe that middle one has something to do with, it's something really sophisticated. And maybe some of maybe the other two less so. So when we swapped those words out, those were nonsense words, by the way. These are actual words. We swapped those out for words that we understand. Then these words kind of reinforce the meaning that the typeface has already carried. So they go with our expectations. But then what happens if we change the words to something we're not expecting? The communication gets a little different. So a garage sale deal, not what you're expecting to see in a nice fancy script type like that. But maybe it's communicating something specifically. I made a little Venn diagram here. You can see, the literal meaning of the words discount and, sale and garage, not what you're expecting to see with that typeface, but then you've got the elegant script typeface. So it kind of makes the communication really more pinpointed and specific. Perhaps this is a sale for luxury cars at a really nice car dealership. Who knows? I don't know. But it makes your brain start to think a little bit, which is kind of interesting. How about this? You're probably noticing some tension here. So probably because the form of the letters, which look like they were written with a big black magic marker, and they're on this billboard, which kind of implies access to a lot of money and a really tall ladder at the very least. And so those two things are at odds with each other. Here's another example of that. Doesn't come across quite the same way without the bold sans serif all caps we're used to seeing on a red octagon like this. And there are lots of things a designer has to consider when they're choosing a typeface for a piece. One of them is whether or not the shapes or forms of the letters aesthetically go with the rest of what's going on in the piece. A lot of times it's kind of about the visual tone that it has. In this case, the visual tone doesn't really match our expectations for that red octagon. And then a lot of typefaces have an intended use that they were designed for. And so you want to be thinking about that when you pick a typeface too. If it was designed for books, you probably don't want to be putting it really large on a billboard, perhaps. So here's another example. I don't know if you recognize this typeface. Okay, yeah. You're onto what I'm doing here. So yeah, it's so associated with Tootsie Rolls. Now, if you put it on a brown background, it really makes it obvious that it's the Tootsie Roll typeface. And of course, if you change the word to Tootsie Roll, then it's pretty obvious too. But that's another thing designers have to be aware of when they're choosing a typeface. Like, does this typeface have any sort of cultural associations or baggage with it that I need to be aware of. So you wouldn't want to use this typeface on a brown background, especially if your word starts with T and has a couple of O's after it. Then people are going to start to go to Tootsie Roll pretty quickly because they're used to seeing that. One more quick example: same message, completely different letter forms. And you can see how that really changes the meaning of the communication. Okay, so one thing, you've probably heard me referring to type as typefaces, but a lot of people nowadays refer to those as fonts, and there actually is a difference between those things. So this is what you would call a typeface, which is the actual design of the letter forms themselves, whereas the font is the technology that's used to reproduce that typeface. So in this case, it could be metal type set by hand. That would be a font, as well as the font file on your computer. That's also a font. So that's the technology that's making it possible. And then here are a few basic terms before we get into some of the more of the history of things. First of all, a serif. Are all of you familiar with the serif? Hopefully you are. So serifs are those smaller strokes that come off the main strokes. At the bottom of letter forms, a lot of times they look like little feet. So it's the little feature there highlighted in orange. Hopefully you can see that. So that's something to be watching for as we go through history, how that serif changed. And then also the contrast between the thick and thin strokes in a letter form. You'll notice how that changes and evolves over time. So now we're going to take a quick tour through some history. And this is, of course, really quick and leaving out a lot of stuff, but it gives you kind of an idea of the general arc of things. So here is sort of the overview slide. And you can see, generally speaking, older styles to the left, moving to newer styles to the right. And then, so as you might have expected, typography started with the development of movable type. Of course, it was based on a lot of things that came before that. Before that would have been considered writing or calligraphy. But then, of course, Gutenberg didn't come up with movable type or printing. The Chinese actually developed that much earlier, but when he came out with his movable type and printing in 1455, it really had an explosive effect on the way things were done. And the first typefaces were reproductions of the hand lettering of scribes, as you can see here. Printing technology promoted uniformity in type design. So basically, and there's a picture of the Gutenberg Bible. Maybe you've seen it before. And here's a detail of the Gutenberg Bible on the right with something you might have seen coming out of a medieval scribe on the left. And you can see how the design of the letter forms is pretty much taking most of its cues from that. It's just kind of a cleaned up version of that. So that's what gives us black letter. This is a more recent digital typeface, but it's also in the black letter tradition. But new designs soon emerged, inspired by classical Roman and Greek letter forms. So after the printing press was developed, all this minutiae created new type designs that were uniquely matched to the material properties of the metal type. They were smaller and more elegant, and we get old style faces like Palatino, Bembo, Aldis, and also designers such as Garamond and Caslon. Hopefully those names are ringing a bell. You've probably seen them on your list of fonts on your computer. And here are some examples of old style typefaces. Of course, these are the digital versions, but Bembo on the top and Palatino on the bottom. And then as the technology to make the type improved, you can see this gradual progression from thicker serifs and strokes to thinner serifs. And so that's what this slide is showing. The thicker, more angled serif on the top is progressing down to the really thin serif at the bottom. And so that gives us the next classification, which is transitional. And that is characterized by just that change in thickness of the serif, as well as you get a little bit more contrast in the stroke weight in the letter form. And here's a transitional that's pretty well known. It's called Baskerville. You can see it's got those sharper serifs. And here's a specimen of Baskerville. So a specimen, type specimen, is what the type foundry would use to promote the typeface and get printers to buy it. So they would print these pieces with examples of the typefaces, so they would could market them to the various printers. So, and then that brings us to the next style, which is the modern typeface. As the name would apply, as the name transitional would apply, or would imply, it was just a transition between styles. And so these modern typefaces had really thin serifs, and they became more crisp, more elegant, more upright, more geometrically informed, and a little bit less informed by the hand. So that gives us faces such as Bodoni, which is a classic specimen of a modern typeface. And here are some of his actual specimens, printed in 1818. You can see those nice, elegant letter forms, and the really strong thick to thin stroke contrast in the letters. And then here are some more recent type specimens of Bodoni's type from the 1950s. So his typeface continued to be sold by type foundries. And then the next style is fairly self-explanatory. You can see the progression here. The slab serif on the right, of course, and slab, it gets its name from the thick square-like slabs. Here's Clarendon, which is a pretty well-known slab serif typeface. And this was during the 1800s. So you see these slab serifs appearing a lot in posters and advertising of the time. In this case, this slab serif here is printed with wood type. You can see the detail on the right there. You can kind of see the texture of the wood, and you can see how the serif on that H is broken off. Looks like a piece of wood that's been broken off. So, so wood was much lighter and cheaper than metal. If you could imagine having giant letters that were made out of metal, how heavy that would have been and how expensive it would have been to create those with wood. So, sorry, with metal instead of wood. So wood type was used for a lot of the larger scale letters. And here are some examples of some styles that were used in the wood type era. And there was really quite a proliferation of different styles that happened during this time because of the need for public advertising. Here's a more recent wood type printing from, let's see, 2015, so pretty recent. But you can see the creative things you can do with wood type. And this is also a newer example, though this was something they were doing back in the 1800s as well, I believe. So this is what's known as a chromatic wood type face. So it actually has two different forms that are related to each other. And then those can be printed overlapping each other to create a third color and create pretty interesting effects. So you can still buy this today at Virgin Wood Type, which is a company that is actively manufacturing wood type, which you don't see a lot of those now. Here's another innovation in type technology, the linotype machine, which came out in the 1880s, which really sped up the printing process. The type was set by entering the message with the attached keyboard. You can see the keyboard in front that they're typing on. And then as they typed those letters, it would arrange the molds for the different letter forms in a row. And then the molten metal would go into the molds and actually cast an entire line of type at a time. So it really sped up that process. They weren't picking type a letter at a time from a type case. So here's the comparison there. You can see on the right there those linotype giant slugs of metal where everything's connected, whereas on the left you're doing it a letter at a time. And then finally, type without serifs emerges. And this gives us faces such as Helvetica, which you're probably familiar with, which is one of the most common and pervasive serifs. Maybe some of you have seen the documentary about Helvetica, which is named Helvetica from several years ago. It's quite good, I would recommend it. And then here's a comparison showing the progression of serifs to sans serifs. And you can see the relationships between each step here. And of course, the sans serifs were very popular back in the modernist era. Here's Bauhaus magazine. You can see all the sans serifs being used on it. And then this is going back to that specimen I showed at the beginning from Adrian Fruediker for his typeface Univers. Univers was a full type family, which meant it had several weights of type that were designed to go together and work together. And Univers actually included a pretty interesting numbering system where the number, each weight had a number, and so you could tell by the number which version of the typeface it was. You can see the numbers get larger as they get bolder, and also you've got oblique or italic versions in there. So, and then here's yet another version of a sans serif, which becomes very geometric, losing all connection to the hand. And this typeface on the right you're seeing is Futura, which is kind of your quintessential geometric sans serif typeface. And you can see there that almost perfect circular O and the almost perfect triangular W. And here's the whole face of Futura. And then you can see here a type specimen for Futura, emphasizing its geometric characteristics. And another one. And then an ad using Futura. And here's another ad from that time period. So everything was getting really geometric, but then things kind of started to walk back a little bit, and some of the harsh geometry, or sometimes the geometry was a little harsh, and people were looking for something a little softer and more inviting. So that's where we get the humanist sans serif. So you can see here, we've got the transitional Baskerville, and then the grotesque sans, like Helvetica, and then we've got a humanist sans on the right. And you can see how that humanist sans is taking cues from the transitional type. It's got a two-story G, just like the Baskerville. It's got softer strokes. It's got more variation in the stroke weight, whereas that grotesque type feels a lot more rigid. And here's another example of humanist faces also incorporated true italics with them. So a true italic is based more on handwriting, so you get flowier forms and strokes in your letters, whereas in Helvetica, it's really an oblique, not an italic, so it's just made by taking the Roman forms and angling them a little bit, whereas in an italic, the forms are actually different. So like that flowing F in the Baskerville, you can see that being echoed in the flowing F of the meta over there. So meta is a good example of a humanist sans serif. This was actually designed in the 1990s by Erich Spiekermann. It's a German designer. So here we are back to our overview again. You can see the progression of where we've been. And of course, there are lots of styles that are not included in this. I was just kind of going over the basic ones. There's another huge category you would call display faces, which get really showy and crazy and maybe only have uses in specific cases. And we'll take a look at a few of those later. So the next typographic innovation was the advent of photo composing, which was they used a photographic process to compose the letter forms instead of the mechanical processes and the metal of the past. And this brought several advantages. Things became crisper and sharper. Corrections could be made electronically. And it was a lot more flexible because you could mix different styles and sizes of type together really easily. If you think about the constraints of all of your letter forms are attached to a big chunk of metal, a big metal rectangle, you can only do so many things because everything's got to lock into that grid on the press. But now that wasn't an issue with photographic processes. So here's an example here. This is what's known as kerning. So if you look at the letter or the word typography up there, that T and that Y can't get spaced close enough in metal type because they're both attached to a rectangle. But it allows the typographer or the type designer to make fine adjustments to where certain pairs of letters get scooted closer together so that you get a nice, more even spacing throughout the word. And so photo typesetting allowed for this sort of thing to happen. And it also spurred new developments in what you could do with type design. So this is a typeface by Matthew Carter, a really well-known type designer. He designed for Donna, which you've probably seen on your computer as well. But Snell Roundhand, which is a really elegant formal script, was a possibility now because the letter forms could actually overlap and touch a little bit. So creating that formal script with the connections between letters was not possible. So this design was actually informed by that technological advancement. And like I said, here's some examples of display faces. There's so many of them. They're all over the place. And they really also exploded with the photo typesetting because it allowed for new creative solutions. You can see letter forms that touch and overlap and kind of get into each other's space on some of these that you wouldn't have seen previously. Here's a creative logo designed in the 60s, which demonstrates the creative possibilities of overlapping type of different sizes and styles, which would not have been possible previously. And then this slide shows what production process might have looked like back then. So you've got the production mechanicals there on the left that the designer would have given to the printer. And you can see on that middle one, the designer is making notes as to what the colors should be and kind of like filling in a little bit of it so the printer knows how to translate that black and white into the final color version on the right. And I would also point out that the radiating design of this calendar where it goes in a circle, that would have been pretty difficult to do with metal type. But with photo composing, that sort of thing was not possible. This is another typeface by Matthew Carter called Bell Centennial. And this typeface was designed with the specific constraints of a telephone book in mind. If you think of the really poor quality newsprint this would have been printed on, and also the need to pack as many names and numbers as possible into the telephone directory, that's what he was working with this typeface. So if you look at that letter N, you notice how it has those really odd little like shapes in the negative spaces in the counterforms there. And the reason for that is when you're printing on a poor quality newsprint paper, the ink actually soaks into the paper a little bit and spreads. So he designed it this way to counteract that. So at those smaller sizes, once the wet ink hit the paper and spread a little bit, it would fill in those little square shapes in the counterforms there, and that would actually look more like the N you would expect to see without those clunky rectangular shapes inside it. And then, of course, there was the advent of digital typesetting, which allowed the designer to have even more control over the production process. Here's one really well-known piece from that time period. So this is Emigre magazine, which was an experimental design magazine, mostly for designers. It had a lot of writing about design, critical writing about design in it. And also, Emigre was a type foundry and sold their own type. And so they were using it as a way to promote their type. And you can see a lot of the digital influence in the design here. You can also see the variety of typefaces. You can see things are getting quite a bit looser and more active than maybe some of the modernist designs. Even the text spreads of the magazine, you can see they're having a lot of fun here, not using perfect rectangles, pushing some boundaries a little bit. Wolfgang Weingart, also a very well-known designer from this time period who was a pioneer of postmodern design. This is one of his pieces for a design exhibition. Here's a piece by Martin Benesky from Appetite Engineers. That was the agency from 2000. You can see the really kind of loose use of type in here. And also during the digital era, you see revivals of old classics that are turned into digital fonts for use on the computer. So this is Trajan type from Trajan's column, classical Roman type. And this was the inspiration for Carol Twombly, who is an in-house type designer at Adobe, designed the Trajan Pro typeface, which you've probably seen in a ton of movie posters, the big epic dramas. You'll see a lot of Trajan Pro in some of those. Usually it's molded to look like it's gold or something like that, but a lot of the time that's Trajan Pro. So watch out for that. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at some environmental typography, some installations that use type. And I think some of these will connect a little bit with the exhibition that's downstairs. He does have that one piece that's basically type installed on the wall, and he's got the projection mapping on it. It looks really cool. So here's some other interesting type installations. So this first one is from Stefan Sagmeister. I don't know if you've heard of him. Austrian-born designer, but he's been practicing in the US for quite some time. Kind of a character known for some of the outlandish things he does, or also really creative things he does. But he made this typographic installation using just bananas for an exhibition in New York. And you can see the green bananas versus the yellow bananas. And that's him there on the right looking at the installation. It has 10,000 bananas. And if it's a little hard to read the words, but it says there, self-confidence produces fine results. And the interesting thing about this piece is he was thinking about how it would age over time. And for a time, all of the letters disappeared. And then I think this is one of the later ones where you get a little bit of a hint of the message coming back again, as maybe some of those bananas that were on the letters weren't quite as old as the bananas surrounding them. And I can't even imagine what this must have smelled like, 10,000 bananas in one room. I'm sure it was quite an experience to see it at this stage. Here's another typographic installation he did, made with 250,000 euro cents in a plaza in Amsterdam. And it took 8 days and 100 volunteers to set this up. And there's the finished piece there. And it says, I don't know if you can see it, obsessions make my life worse and my work better. Pretty appropriate, I think, for the material he used to create it. Here's a detail. And they actually sorted the pennies into different colors so they could create, those flowers that you see in the previous image here. And then the funny part of this is 20 hours later, someone noticed someone taking pennies and pocketing them. And they called the police, and the police just swept the whole thing up. So they thought they were saving it. Here's another typographic installation he did. So this word having is part of a larger phrase. Having guts always works out for me. But what's interesting about this is it's anamorphic. So you can only see that message if you view it from the right point of view. But from the side, this is what it looks like. Here's a more recent installation by Paprika, which is a studio in Canada. And this installation is also anamorphic. It's a little hard to tell, but the letters on the back row, on the taller posts, are actually larger than the letters on the front row. And the reason for that is when you view it from the right angle, all the letters look like they're the same scale. And to translate, it says, a time will come when you can express yourself freely. And that's what it looks like at night. The letters are also illuminated at nighttime. This piece is interactive with the audience. So this is the Dutch Studio Spaas. And so this typographic installation is actually made up of these little modules, which are tear pads of yellow paper that have different black forms printed on them. And so then the audience could come in and tear off layers and reveal new forms and new patterns below. And you kind of get the idea here. And even the leftovers were actually quite beautiful. Let's see, I'm trying to get, there it is. I have to play. There's a time lapse of how it might have changed over time. Okay, this next example is not a type installation, but it's a typeface that really takes into account accessibility. It's called Atkinson Hyperlegible. It's designed by Applied Design, which is a studio in New York, and they did it in collaboration with the Braille Institute. And it is also available for a free download if you want to check it out and use it on your computer. So you can see here on the right, they're demonstrating how it's more legible, or how it is still possibly legible with these different eye conditions that you might have, different impairments. It's a little small to see, but each time it changes, you can see the type of impaired vision that it might look like that. And the way they designed this, they were thinking about trying to make forms that are confused with each other as different as possible. So you can see that here, where they're adding extra features on that I, or on that L, it's got the little curve at the bottom. So they're trying to make each letter that's similar as different as possible to make it more legible. And here's another example from their website. So you can see the B8 on the left is Helvetica, but then they changed the size of those two loops on the 8 so that it's easier to tell a B from an 8 when it gets blurry. And the same thing there, the demonstration of the added features to the I's and L's that make them a little easier to distinguish from each other when you're not seeing it quite as clearly. Okay, this next example is from the studio Pentagram, which is a really well-known, pretty famous graphic design studio in New York and elsewhere. They have offices around the world. But this is Michael Beirut's team did this. So they were tasked with updating the Saks Fifth Avenue logo, which is what you see on the left here. That's their updated version of it. And then they had to design a different brand attributes to go with that, elements to go with that. And what they actually did was just sliced it up with a grid, and it made these little tiles, and then they rearranged the tiles to make different interesting patterns. So it still relates back to the main identity, the type and the main identity, but it kind of creates this abstract pattern, which is pretty nice. Okay, so new font formats also opened up new possibilities. So OpenType font format is kind of a more advanced digital format for fonts. And it can incorporate programming. So this allows for stylistic variations of letter forms to be automatically substituted as you type. And this is based on a typeface designed by Ken Barber earlier, back in the 1959. But then later Ed, I can't pronounce his name, and some other designers from House Industries designed this OpenType version of it that you can, as you type, you can see it responding and substituting those combined overlapping letters when you type the right combination of letters. And here's another version of a font that does that. This one's kind of out there, but you can see the connections that happen. So right here right here, between the S and the T, see that crazy lightning-shaped connection? If you type it without that, with a space between, then you don't get that connection, and you have a different version of the letter that gets substituted. And then we're going to take it a step further to variable type. So you've probably heard me mention the term type family. Yeah, I talked about it earlier, but here's an example of a traditional type family. Again, this is Adrian Frutiger's Univers. And each style or each weight is kind of set. They're predetermined by the designer. But when you get a variable typeface, so you can see the static type or the traditional type on the top where it says static, and then the variable typeface on the bottom, you can see that basically what the designer does is designs the lightest letter form and the boldest letter form, and then the computer fills in the in-between so that you can have that letter be anywhere from as light as the lightest to as bold as the boldest. And so the designer can actually drag a slider to decide how bold that type should be. And people are doing this with other attributes of type as well. So the widths of letter forms. And this is quite handy if you're designing with type and you need something that is a certain proportion to fit in a certain space. It's really nice to just like drag it and get it exactly the proportion you want it. Some other examples. This one, you can see the italicization or the angle happening on the upper one in the light blue. And then this one on the bottom is pretty interesting where it's adding serifs or taking away serifs. So, and this is another one that the letters change width, but in a less expected way. So now I'll show a few examples of my own typographic work. So these, you might have noticed these letter forms at the beginning of my presentation, those larger letter forms. This is actually a typeface, or actually a family of type I've been working on designing over the past few years. And I currently have about 4 weights of it finished. And you can see on the right there, that's what it looks like in the font design software that I'm using. And then these are some typographic illustrations I made for a media literacy textbook, which was written by another Western professor, Sue Ellen Christians, in the communications department. So it was sort of a collaboration with her, but I made these illustrations for her book. And here's another spread from that. So those are maybe more the traditional uses you'd think of for type, but then I'm also doing a lot of animation. This is a piece called Averted Sanctuaries 6, and my Averted Sanctuary series is actually a whole series of objects that turn inside out as a metaphor for introversion. And in this piece, I used the book as the object to animate, and you'll notice in the book that's the typeface that I designed as well. So, and this is an animation. These are just some still frames of it. The letter forms explode and eventually escape the book. And here's a clip of it. You get the idea. This is another piece. It doesn't use type per se, but it does use font technology as kind of part of my creative process. So this has a layer of animated fibers, and then it's got layers of digital animation on top of that. And so these pixelated digital forms that you see in front are actually, the way I created those was with fonts. So I assigned a different form to every letter. So they weren't your typical letter forms. They were what I wanted to be in here. Some of them are like fragments of little social media, recognizable icons and things. And so I took tweets and then translated those away from their typical, the typical letters you'd see, and kind of replaced them with these digital fragments. And then that turned into an animation. So each tweet I put in there became a frame of the animation. And so you get this layering effect that happens. And I've got a short clip of this as well. So all these kind of angled grid-like forms, those are all fonts I designed. So you get the idea. And then these are a few shots of some of my new work. I'm working on a series of books that all have typography in them. but they are also video animations. And they are, so it's a pretty interesting combination of a lot of my creative interests. It's got typography, it's got animation, and it's got bookmaking, which I like doing all of those things. And the work explores the tension between opposing concepts. So here's the cover of one of them. And this is an interior spread. And again, these are animated. I don't have the animations with me today, but I'll be having an exhibition here in town at Western in the Richmond Center. And that'll open at the end of May. So if you're interested, you can come check it out. And here's another piece. You can see the letter forms on the pages there. So, and that's everything I have. So I'm assuming we have time for questions, but thanks, everybody. Yeah.
So I helped do a newsletter for the